What does a government look like the moment it runs out of answers? Not the polished deflection, not the rehearsed denial, but the raw, unscripted freeze of a spokesperson who has been handed an impossible question on live television in front of the entire world and simply has nothing credible left to say. That moment happened. It was caught on camera. And it revealed far more about the Islamic Republic of Iran than any intelligence briefing ever could. The backdrop matters enormously here. The protests that erupted across Iran beginning in late December 2025 were sparked by a catastrophic collapse of the Iranian rial, soaring inflation, chronic state mismanagement of essential services and living conditions that had deteriorated to a point where ordinary Iranians, shopkeepers, teachers, factory workers, students simply had nothing left to lose. What began with merchants pulling down shutters at Tehran's Grand Bazaar spread with remarkable speed to more than 200 cities across the country, making this the largest and most geographically widespread uprising in Iran since the 1979 Islamic Revolution itself. Demonstrators were not simply asking for cheaper bread or a lower electricity bill. They were demanding loudly and at enormous personal risk an end to the Islamic Republic's entire model of governance. That is the scale of what was unfolding, and that is the political pressure under which Tehran's foreign ministry spokesperson sat down in front of Western cameras and prepared to explain it all away. The confrontation that followed became a case study in what happens when official denial collides with documented reality at full speed. Amnesty International had gathered verified videos and eyewitness accounts, showing security forces positioned on streets and on the rooftops of buildings, including houses, mosques, and police stations, repeatedly firing rifles and shotguns loaded with metal pellets at protesters, frequently targeting their heads and torsos. These were not second-hand allegations sourced from governments with obvious strategic interests. The interviewer made that point with surgical precision. This was Amnesty International, an organization that has consistently and publicly criticized both the United States and Israeli governments on multiple occasions. When the spokesperson was asked why the world should trust Tehran over Amnesty, the response was not a counter-argument supported by data or an alternative accounting of events. It was a flat dismissal the evidence had somehow been compiled and provided by Israel and the United States. The interviewer pushed back immediately, noting that Israeli officials themselves routinely and loudly accuse Amnesty of fabricating evidence against them. The spokesperson had no response to that. What followed was silence dressed up as rhetoric. The significance of that exchange cannot be overstated. An official representing the Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs publicly confirmed that security forces had fired directly at protesters, a statement that punctured every prior denial in a single sentence. Yet even after that confirmation landed on the record, the regime's media apparatus continued its attempt to reframe the violence as a foreign-sponsored destabilization campaign. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi told foreign diplomats in Tehran that the protests had been deliberately turned violent to provide President Donald Trump with a pretext for military intervention, a framing that requires one to believe that tens of thousands of Iranians risked imprisonment, injury, and death in the streets of more than 200 cities, not out of genuine desperation, but as a coordinated geopolitical performance staged for Washington's benefit. The credibility of that argument speaks entirely for itself. What made the television confrontation particularly damaging for Tehran was its timing and its context. The Islamic Republic had spent years constructing a parallel media strategy, deploying articulate Western-educated officials onto American and European networks to argue that sanctions were unjust, that nuclear negotiations were being pursued in good faith, and that Iran was a rational state actor fully capable of responsible regional diplomacy. That strategy depends entirely on the officials in question appearing composed, credible, and in command of the facts. When that composure collapsed visibly publicly on camera in real time, it did not merely embarrass one spokesperson. It exposed the structural impossibility of defending what cannot be defended. The regime's violent response to protesters was not an isolated policy failure born of panic. It was a continuation of a long and documented pattern of state violence against its own citizens, stretching back decades, in which the playbook has remained essentially unchanged. Deny, deflect, discredit the sources, and wait for the world's attention to move elsewhere. This time, however, the world did not move on. The camera kept rolling, and the spokesperson sitting in front of it with no answer became perhaps unintentionally the most honest moment the Islamic Republic had produced in years. The real question now is not whether the regime lied. The evidence of that is categorical, cross-referenced, and internationally verified. The question is whether the scale of what has been documented will finally produce a response from the international community that matches it. And that answer begins with understanding exactly what that documentation contains and why Tehran is so terrified of it. There is a specific kind of political courage required to stand in front of a camera and deny what the entire world has already seen. But courage is not quite the right word for what Tehran's officials have been doing. What they have been demonstrating is something closer to institutional reflex, the automatic, deeply conditioned response of a government that has spent decades denying, deflecting, and waiting out international outrage. The problem this time is that the evidence they are being asked to deny has grown into something so vast, so meticulously documented, and so geographically comprehensive that no deflection can contain it. To understand the scale of what has been compiled against the Islamic Republic, it is necessary to start not with the largest numbers, which remain contested precisely because the regime made independent verification nearly impossible, but with what was confirmed in the opening days of the crackdown alone, before the internet went dark and the hospitals were placed under security surveillance. Between December 31st, 2025 and January 3rd, 2026, just 4 days, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch jointly confirmed the killing of at least 28 protesters and bystanders, including children, across 13 cities and 8 provinces. That figure, grim as it is, represents only what 2 major organizations were able to independently cross-reference at the very start of the violence, before the regime tightened its information blackout to near total darkness. The geography of those early killings matters enormously. The provinces of Loristan and Elam, home to Kurdish and Luri ethnic minorities who have historically faced elevated state repression, recorded the deadliest crackdowns, with at least 8 confirmed dead in Loristan and 5 in Elam in the first 4 days alone. In the city of Azna in Loristan province, a verified video showed Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps personnel firing directly at protesters near a county governor's office in Azadagan Square. After the crowd dispersed, they regrouped near a police station and security forces opened fire again. This was not crowd control. This was pursuit. The weapons deployed were themselves a statement of intent. Security forces, including the IRGC and Iran's National Police, known by its Persian acronym Faraja, unlawfully deployed rifles, shotguns loaded with metal pellets, water cannons, and tear gas against what human rights organizations consistently described as largely peaceful demonstrations. An independent pathologist consulted by Amnesty International reviewed images of the injured and the dead. The targeting was not random. Protesters were frequently shot in the head and torso. Many were shot from behind while fleeing. The head of Tehran's Farabi Eye Hospital publicly announced that 1,000 people had presented with eye injuries during the December protests alone. a figure that medical analysts described as consistent with the deliberate use of metal pellets, aimed at faces, a tactic that results in permanent blindness at a rate that makes its use deeply troubling under any reading of international humanitarian law. Several doctors and medical staff were subsequently detained for treating wounded protesters and for refusing to cooperate with security officers who arrived at hospitals demanding that injured patients be reported to authorities rather than treated. This detail, confirmed by at least one physician who received the order directly in Tehran, was also raised during the live television confrontation with the Foreign Ministry spokesperson and received no credible answer whatsoever. As the days progressed and the internet blackout tightened its grip, the verification process became exponentially more difficult, but the evidence continued to surface. Verified footage analyzed by Amnesty International from January 10th showed at least 205 body bags at a makeshift overflow morgue established at Karizak near Tehran. Families searching through hundreds of bodies trying to identify their loved ones were, according to witnesses, being turned away by security personnel who told them they could not claim the remains. By late January 2026, casualty estimates from the broader crackdown ranged from approximately 3,117, according to Iranian state media's own figures, to more than 30,000, cited by independent sources and medical professionals working inside the country under extraordinary personal risk. The UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Iran stated that civilian deaths were estimated at 5,000 or more, with internal medical reports suggesting the true toll could be 20,000 or higher. The total range of estimates as of late January spanned from 7,000 to upwards of 36,000, making this, by any credible accounting, among the largest episodes of state violence against Iranian civilians in the modern history of the Islamic Republic. And yet, the spokesperson sitting in that television studio had no answer. Not because the question was unfair, but because no answer exists that is simultaneously honest and survivable for a regime that has staked everything on the fiction that it governs with the consent of its people. What the evidence has revealed is not just a massacre. It has revealed a government so threatened by its own citizens that it chose methodically and at scale to kill them rather than listen to them. The world now holds that record. The question that demands an answer next is not about what the regime did to its people. It is about what the regime has done to itself, and whether a government capable of this kind of violence was ever genuinely a republic to begin with. There is a question that has haunted the Islamic Republic since the moment its founder Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini declared victory over the Pahlavi dynasty in 1979. What happens to a revolution when it becomes the very thing it overthrew? That question is no longer theoretical. It has been answered publicly and unmistakably in the form of a 56-year-old mid-ranking cleric named Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the late Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who was announced on March 8, 2026, as the Islamic Republic's third Supreme Leader. A revolution that defined its entire identity by destroying hereditary rule had, in the span of a single week, quietly restored it. To understand how profound that contradiction is, it is necessary to go back to what Khomeini actually wrote and said about dynastic power. He was not vague on the subject. He wrote extensively about how the Islamic Republic must not become a monarchy because hereditary succession was precisely the corruption the revolution had set out to eliminate. The Shah's dynasty was the enemy. The Pahlavi name was the symbol of everything the revolution stood against. And yet, the process by which Mojtaba Khamenei was elevated to the supreme leadership reproduced in clerical dress the exact dynastic logic that Khomeini had condemned. A father prepared his son for succession. The The security apparatus, specifically the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, applied what multiple sources described as heavy pressure on members of the Assembly of Experts to ratify that succession. And when opposition materialized, including a reported written will presented to the Assembly arguing that hereditary rule violated the essence of the 1979 revolution, the IRGC's counteroffensive overwhelmed it. The constitutional mechanics that were supposed to prevent exactly this outcome deserve careful examination because the regime has consistently pointed to them as evidence of democratic legitimacy. Iranians do elect the Assembly of Experts, the 88 senior clerics constitutionally responsible for selecting the supreme leader. That is true. But the Guardian Council, a separate body of 12 jurists, vets every candidate who seeks to run for those seats. And the supreme leader himself held decisive influence over the Guardian Council. The result is a system where the appearance of democratic process conceals a feedback loop that has reliably reproduced the same narrow power-holding group since 1979. The supreme leader shapes who can run for the body that selects the supreme leader. Calling that democracy requires a definition of the word so elastic as to be meaningless, which is precisely the point the television interviewer was making when the foreign ministry spokesperson tried to claim otherwise. What makes the succession of Mojtaba Khamenei particularly significant is not simply the dynastic symbolism, it is what it reveals about who actually holds power inside the Islamic Republic in 2026. Mojtaba does not hold the title of Ayatollah in the traditional sense. He has published no major scholarly work of Islamic jurisprudence, a qualification that has historically been considered foundational for anyone aspiring to clerical leadership at this level. What he does possess is deep, long-standing ties to the IRGC and its paramilitary arm, the Basiji, developed over more than a decade of coordinating the suppression of protest movements, beginning with the Green Movement of 2009. His rise was not a product of religious authority. It was a product of security relationships, and that distinction matters enormously for understanding what kind of state Iran has now become. The protests that erupted across more than 200 cities in late December 2025 and the massacre that followed did not happen in a vacuum. They happened inside a state where inflation had exceeded 40%, the real had collapsed to historic lows, and a population that had suffered under sanctions mismanagement and endemic corruption had run entirely out of patience. And the regime's response, mass killing, hospital surveillance, internet blackout, and mass detention was not a panicked overreaction. It was a deliberate institutional choice made by a government that had concluded long ago that coercion was more reliable than legitimacy. Mojtaba Khamenei's appointment formalized that conclusion at the highest possible level. As one analyst at the Gulf International Forum put it, his succession did not inaugurate a new political phase, so much as it formalized the regime's ongoing re-entrenchment around its security apparatus. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini reportedly opposed hereditary succession to the end. According to accounts presented to the Assembly of Experts during the succession crisis of March 2026, he had written that dynastic rule would violate the very essence of the Islamic Revolution. If that is accurate, then the revolution founded in his name ended not with a foreign invasion, not with a popular uprising, but with a clerical assembly ratifying under IRGC pressure. The appointment of a supreme leader's son to his father's throne. Iran's last monarchy fell in 1979 beneath a crown. Its new one rose in 2026 beneath a turban. The question that this raises for the region and for the world is not simply whether the Islamic Republic has betrayed its founding principles, it clearly has. The question is what a regime that has abandoned the pretense of democratic legitimacy, that governs through coercion rather than consent, and that has just installed a hereditary leader backed by its military security apparatus, is capable of doing next, both to its own people and to its neighbors. And that question begins with understanding what it has already done to the flow of information inside its own borders. Consider the following for a moment. On January 8, 2026, at precisely 8 in the evening, Tehran time, the Islamic Republic of Iran pulled the plug on the internet for 92 million of its own citizens. Not a throttle, not a slowdown. A near-total blackout, the most sophisticated and most comprehensive internet shutdown in Iran's modern history, reducing national connectivity to approximately 3% of ordinary levels almost immediately. Within days, that figure fell further still. By early March, following Israeli and American strikes on February 28th, NetBlocks recorded internet connectivity in Iran collapsing to just 1% of normal levels, a figure so close to zero that it functionally describes a country that had been digitally sealed from the rest of the world. And yet, even as that shutdown was being engineered, implemented, and defended by Tehran's own communications ministry, Iranian foreign ministry officials were boarding planes, logging onto satellite connections, and sitting down in front of Western television cameras to explain to the world that their government had nothing to hide. That contradiction is not a minor inconsistency. It is the central fact of the Islamic Republic's information strategy in 2026, and it deserves to be examined with the seriousness it demands. A government that genuinely had nothing to hide does not need to spend $35.7 million per day, the figure acknowledged by Iran's own Minister of Communications, Sattar Hashemi, to prevent its citizens from communicating with each other and with the outside world. A government that has not massacred its own people does not need to station security personnel in hospitals with instructions to report the wounded rather than treat them, and then simultaneously cut off the international connectivity that would allow those events to be documented and transmitted. The internet shutdown was not a security measure. It was a confession, one written in the language of network traffic data rather than words, and one that every major digital rights organization in the world read clearly and documented in detail. The technical scope of what Iran engineered in January 2026 represented a significant evolution from previous shutdowns. During the 2022 Mahsa Amini protests, authorities had imposed nightly mobile network curfews of roughly 2 weeks in duration, affecting mobile networks, but leaving fixed-line connections largely intact to limit economic damage. That approach allowed approximately 100 hours of cumulative mobile disruption while preserving enough connectivity to prevent catastrophic economic collapse. The January 2026 shutdown was categorically different. Iran's national information network, the domestic intranet the regime had spent years building as an alternative to the global web, was also disconnected internally, an unprecedented step that cut Iranians off not just from the outside world, but from each other. Mobile network antennas were disabled, phone lines were cut, high-volume data transmission was restricted, SIM cards belonging to known activists and social organizers were deactivated individually. The economic consequences were immediate, severe, and, in a bitter irony, directly worsened the very conditions that had driven people into the streets in the first place. Online sales collapsed by 80% during the shutdown period. The Tehran Stock Exchange overall index shed 450,000 points over just 4 days, and an estimated 130 trillion tomans were lost daily from financial transaction volumes. The number of financial transactions across Iran dropped by 185 million in January alone. Private postal company Typax, a major employer in Iran's logistics sector, reported that its daily shipments fell from approximately 32,000 packages to fewer than a few hundred within days of the complete shutdown, resulting in the immediate unemployment of thousands of drivers and warehouse workers across the country. A former United States State Department official, speaking to The Guardian, described the economic impact as something Iranian authorities would bear direct responsibility for, and warned that the regime might be overplaying its hand in ways that would prove politically unsustainable. The regime's plan, according to research from the digital rights organization FilterWatch, went well beyond a temporary shutdown designed to suppress the immediate protests. Documents obtained by FilterWatch indicated that Iranian authorities had been quietly constructing the architecture for a permanent separation from the global internet modeled loosely on China's Great Firewall, but with ambitions closer to total isolation. The plan, reportedly orchestrated by senior officials and overseen by Iran's armed forces joint command base known as Khatam al-Anbiya, envisioned a future in which ordinary Iranian citizens would have access only to a tightly controlled national network, with the global internet restricted to a small number of pre-approved users. Under legislation passed in 2026, Iranians found using Starlink satellite internet terminals, previously a lifeline during blackouts, faced prison sentences of up to 10 years, with the possibility of execution in cases deemed to involve national security. That last point closes the circle on the television confrontation with which this analysis began. Iranian officials appeared on Western networks because they retained satellite and diplomatic connectivity that their own citizens were denied. They argued that their government was transparent, accountable, and responsive to the Iranian people, while the Iranian people were sitting in digital darkness, unable to communicate, unable to document, and in many cases, unable to reach family members to confirm whether they were alive. The spokesperson, who could not answer a question about Amnesty International's findings, was operating from a position of state-manufactured ignorance. Not his own ignorance, but the ignorance his government had deliberately engineered for 92 million people, who might otherwise have been able to contradict him in real time. The question that follows naturally from that reality is not simply about censorship. It is about what a government capable of this level of control over its own population is simultaneously doing beyond its borders, and what that means for every country in the region that sits within range of its missiles and its proxies. There is a particular strategic miscalculation that governments make when they are operating from desperation rather than calculation. And it is this: they assume that inflicting pain on everyone will eventually cause someone to intervene on their behalf. That was the logic behind Iran's decision to extend its military campaign beyond Israel and the United States, striking Gulf Cooperation Council member states, neutral nations, civilian ports, oil terminals, and commercial shipping lanes in a pattern of aggression so broad and so economically destructive that it did not intimidate the region into submission. It united the region against Iran in a way that decades of diplomacy had failed to achieve. To understand the scale of what Tehran set in motion, the numbers need to be stated plainly. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway 21 miles wide at its narrowest navigable point, sitting between Iran to the north and Oman to the south, is not merely an important shipping lane. It is the single most consequential maritime choke point on the planet. Roughly 27% of the world's maritime trade in crude oil and petroleum products passes through it under normal conditions. Approximately 20% of global liquefied natural gas supply transits it as well, nearly all of it from Qatar. Every barrel of oil produced by Kuwait, Iraq, Bahrain, and Qatar, and the overwhelming majority of production from Saudi Arabia and the UAE, must pass through that strait to reach markets in Asia, Europe, and beyond. When Iran declared the strait closed on March 4, 2026, and began backing that declaration with drone strikes, missile attacks, and the planting of naval mines, it did not simply disrupt regional trade. It detonated a supply shock that reverberated instantaneously across every major economy on Earth. The initial market response alone was staggering. Brent crude oil prices surged 10 to 13% in the first 48 hours following the closure, reaching approximately $80 to $82 per barrel by March 2nd. Within days, with tanker traffic grinding toward a near-total halt and shipping insurance carriers invoking war risk clauses that made transit economically unviable for most operators, analysts revised their forecasts sharply upward. Iran's own military spokesperson issued a statement warning global oil importers to prepare for prices of $200 per barrel, a figure that, if sustained, would represent an economic catastrophe of a scale not seen since the 1973 oil embargo, and one that would cause severe disruption to emerging market economies across Asia and Africa that have no capacity to absorb such a shock. By mid-March, Brent crude had surged past $120 per barrel, and the oil production of Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE had collectively dropped by an estimated 10 million barrels per day, roughly 10% of total global daily supply, simply because the crude could not move out of the Gulf. The consequences extended far beyond crude oil. Qatar, the world's largest LNG exporter, halted production at its two main liquefaction facilities, at Ras Laffan and Masayed Industrial City, following Iranian strikes declaring force majeure on all export contracts. European natural gas futures jumped by roughly 30% in a single day. Following the strikes on Qatar, a catastrophic development for a continent that was already operating with gas storage levels at approximately 30% of capacity following an unusually harsh winter season, and one that immediately revived memories of the energy crisis that followed Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Daily freight rates for LNG tankers jumped more than 40% on the first Monday of March alone. One-third of the world's fertilizer trade, which also transits the strait, was additionally disrupted, a detail that analysts warned would translate into food price inflation across import-dependent nations within weeks. The Gulf Cooperation Council countries, which import over 80% of their caloric intake through the Strait of Hormuz, faced an immediate grocery supply emergency by mid-March, with retailers airlifting food staples as a contingency measure. What Iran almost certainly did not anticipate was the political consequence of targeting neutral parties. Oman, a country that has historically served as one of Tehran's most reliable back-channel diplomatic conduits, maintaining carefully neutral relations with both Iran and the West, was struck by Iranian drones, targeting the deep water ports of Duqm and Salalah, which had been positioned as Hormuz bypass routes. At least one fuel storage tank at Duqm was damaged. The port of Sohar was included in the London insurance market's updated list of high-risk maritime areas, effectively pricing it out of normal commercial use. Iran had not merely attacked a neutral country, it had destroyed the neutrality of the one regional actor best positioned to broker its eventual exit from the crisis. The CEO of Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, Sultan Ahmed Al Jaber, addressing oil industry executives at the CERAWeek conference, stated without qualification that what Iran was doing in the Strait constituted economic terrorism against every nation on earth, and that no country should ever be permitted to hold Hormuz hostage. That statement delivered not by a Western government official with obvious political interests, but by the head of a major state-owned energy company from a country that was absorbing Iranian missile strikes in real time, captured the essential strategic consequence of Iran's regional aggression. The Gulf states had not buckled. They had not pressed Washington for a ceasefire to relieve the pressure. They had drawn a conclusion collectively, deliberately, and with growing unanimity that a temporary ceasefire that left Iran's capabilities intact was not peace. It was a postponement. And that conclusion is now driving the most consequential lobbying effort in the region's modern history, aimed directly at the one man whose decision will determine what comes next. As of Monday, March 30th, 2026, the war between the United States, Israel, and Iran has entered what analysts are cautiously describing as its most dangerous and most consequential phase. President Donald Trump posted on Truth Social that morning, warning that if a deal to end the conflict was not reached shortly, the United States would move ahead with what he described as the complete destruction of Iran's power plants, oil wells, Karg Island. Iran's single most critical crude oil export terminal, handling approximately 90% of the country's oil exports and potentially even its desalination infrastructure, the facilities that supply drinking water to tens of millions of Iranians. Those are not rhetorical threats from a president prone to hyperbole. They are calibrated ultimatums issued with a deadline of April 6, 2026, against the backdrop of the USS Tripoli, an amphibious assault ship carrying approximately 3,500 Marines and sailors arriving in the United States Central Command Area of Responsibility on March 27th, accompanied by Pentagon planning documents that described potential weeks of ground operations near the Strait of Hormuz. The diplomacy and the military buildup are not contradictions. They are two instruments of the same strategy. The 15-point ceasefire plan that Washington transmitted to Tehran via Pakistan after direct negotiations were repeatedly denied by Iranian officials, who insisted they were not in talks with the Americans at all, represents the most comprehensive set of demands the United States has ever formally placed before the Islamic Republic. The list is worth examining in its full scope because it makes unmistakably clear what the Trump administration means when it speaks of a sustainable peace. The plan calls for a 30-day ceasefire as an opening condition, to be followed by the complete dismantling of Iran's nuclear facilities at Natanz, Isfahan, and Fordo. It demands a permanent and legally binding commitment from Tehran to never develop nuclear weapons. It requires the handover of Iran's entire stockpile of already enriched uranium to the International Atomic Energy Agency, along with a commitment to allow the IAEA unrestricted monitoring access to all remaining nuclear infrastructure. Iran must permanently cease uranium enrichment on its own soil. Limits must be placed on the range and total number of its ballistic missiles. All support for regional proxy forces, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iranian-backed militia networks in Iraq and Syria must end. Iranian strikes on regional energy facilities must cease immediately. The Strait of Hormuz must be reopened without conditions. In exchange, the United States has offered the removal of all sanctions imposed on Iran, the ending of the UN snapback mechanism that allows sanctions to be automatically reimposed, and American technical support for electricity generation at Iran's Bushehr civilian nuclear plant. Tehran's response, delivered through Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Esmail Baghai on March 30th, was to describe the proposal as unrealistic, illogical, and excessive, while simultaneously announcing that Iran's parliament was actively reviewing a possible withdrawal from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. That response landed in Washington on the same day that Iran struck a power and desalination plant in Kuwait, killing one Indian worker and wounding 10 Kuwaiti soldiers. Saudi Arabia intercepted 5 ballistic missiles targeting its oil-rich eastern province. A missile over Dubai was intercepted, producing a fireball visible across the city. Iran struck aluminum plants in Bahrain and the UAE. A U.S. airbase in Saudi Arabia was hit, wounding 12 American troops and damaging several aircraft. The Council on Foreign Relations observed that as the conflict continues to expand, to involve new actors with their own distinct interests, a ceasefire becomes increasingly difficult to impose and sustain a conclusion with which every regional government that has absorbed Iranian strikes in recent weeks would agree with considerable force. The Gulf states' position has crystallized into something that no amount of Iranian pressure has been able to soften. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait are not pressing Washington for a rapid ceasefire. They are pressing Washington to hold firm until Iran's full-threat architecture nuclear program, ballistic missile arsenal drone production capacity, and proxy networks has been comprehensively addressed. A UAE Minister of State, Noura al-Kabi, wrote in a column published by The National on March 30th that an Iranian regime that launches ballistic missiles at homes, weaponizes global trade, and supports proxy forces is no longer an acceptable feature of the regional landscape, adding that what the UAE seeks is not merely a ceasefire, but a guarantee that this will never happen again. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, speaking the same week, listed the Trump administration's explicit war aims with unusual clarity: the destruction of Iran's navy, the destruction of its air force, a severe reduction in its missile launching capabilities, and the elimination of its missile and drone production factories, in addition to the prevention of Iran from ever obtaining a nuclear weapon, and the permanent cessation of its support for regional proxies. The human cost of what has unfolded since February 28th, when U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran began, is being tracked in real time by organizations operating under extraordinary pressure. The U.S.-based human rights activists news agency reported on March 28th that at least 3,461 people had been killed since the war began, including 1,551 civilians and at least 236 children. 19 civilians have been killed on the Israeli side. 38 people have been killed across Gulf states and U.S. military positions, including 6 American service personnel in Kuwait and 1 in Saudi Arabia. Iran's government has not released a comprehensive, updated casualty toll. Trump, speaking aboard Air Force One on March 30th, stated that the war had already achieved regime change, pointing to the deaths of numerous Iranian leaders, and that the new leadership was, in his words, much more reasonable. Whether that assessment proves accurate, or whether it represents an overly optimistic reading of a regime that has not yet indicated any willingness to accept Washington's core demands, is the question that will define what comes next. What this conflict has revealed with a clarity that no diplomatic communiqué could match is that the question the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson could not answer on live television, why should the world believe your government, and not the documented evidence of what it has done to its own people, was always about something larger than one press conference. It was about whether a regime that governs through violence, censors its own citizens into digital darkness, installs hereditary leadership under military pressure attacks, neutral neighbors, holds the world's most critical maritime choke point hostage, and then sends its officials onto Western television to deny all of it can survive the convergence of internal collapse and external military pressure simultaneously. That is the central question of this conflict. And the world is watching in real time for its answer. What do you think? Is there any version of a diplomatic settlement that could genuinely address all of these demands? Or has the scale of what has happened made a negotiated peace structurally impossible? Let us know in the comments below. And if analysis like this matters to you, subscribing ensures you never miss the next development as this conflict continues to